Hi, this is Eric Vanderwall, and in this part of Substrate Recipes, we're going to be looking at using events. Now, if you're not already familiar with Substrate, please go ahead and start this series from the beginning because we're not going to really sort of recover anything. We'll do each part as it is. And just like the other parts of this series, we're going to be using Framework 1, not Framework 2, just to lay some groundwork here. Now, what are events? So I'm just going to read straight here from the Substrate Recipes first off because it has a good explanation. And it says, having a transaction included in a block does not guarantee that the function executed successfully. To verify that functions have executed successfully, emit an event at the bottom of the function body. So events notify the off-chain world of successful state transitions. So basically, the event allows the chain itself to notify something off the chain of an event or something having occurred. Okay, so it's just a way for it to communicate out into the world. And as it says here, it's often used just to notify us that, the state transaction, state transaction was successful. Now, I'm not going to go over this too much straight from the documentation. We're going to just jump right into the code and do it from there. And I think that's probably best for us. So let's go ahead and open it up. And again, I'm using JetBrains here, but you can use anything you want, and it's all fine, whatever. So Visual Studio Code is probably the most common. Now, we're going to start off by looking in our palette section here. And in palettes, we have a simple event. We can go ahead to the source, and we're going to choose the library.rs, and it will open this up here. And I've made a few minor changes to, let's have a look here. Actually, I haven't made any changes to the simple event, so that's great. We can follow along just straight out of it here. Now, the difference between simple events and the other kind of events, which is called generic events, is that simple events only can pass primitive types. So these would be strings or numbers represented as like U32 or 16 or 64 or whatever the case may be, rather than say, for example, custom structs or any sort of generics. So to first do this, we need to make sure that, of course, we're using certain things here, and we need to, from the frame support, we need to pull in here to be able to declare an event. We need to be able to declare a module so we can call a function from outside the chain. And we also need to be able to dispatch the dispatch result. So this is what the function returns. Okay. And of course, we also have this use frame system, which allows us to check the origin. So we'll take a look at this below. Now, this has some tests built in, but we're not going to worry about that today. And all of our palettes should start off with something called, and we're using framework 1, it'll be pub trait config, and then the frame system config. So if we're not using anything, it might look like this, but we're using events. Oops. There we go. Now, you really don't need to know too much about what this says here, but you do need to know that you need it, okay? So it's basically, though, just saying, set us up here, configure us to use events. And we don't need to change any of this wording, per palette or anything else. It's always going to stay the same. Now, we have two major sections here. We have first where we're going to declare the module, or it says declare module. And in here, we can write our functions. So for example, this function is just do something. And if you watched the parts before, then you should have an idea of calling functions from off the chain using polkadot.js.org/app. Okay. And then below this, we have where we need to declare the event. So we have to specify the possible events that we can call and what possible value they may pass optionally before we call them. It doesn't need to be before in the code, but it does need to be existing, of course, before we actually call the event. Now, this is a simple event, and we see here it just passes a U32 value. So again, any primitive can be passed through this, and we can give it any name we want. So in this simple event, we just have one event being passed here, but we could go ahead and call it my event, and pass through some other primitive value, and we're going to finish everything off with a comma. So this is considered best practice for Substrate. And we could go ahead and list as many events as we want. In this case, we really just need one event, so we're just going to leave it as one. Now, when we look into the declare module where we can write our functions, this here at the top is always going to be the same in declare modules, and it's just going to check for the origin, because we're going to need this in a minute. What's new here is that we need to have this fn for function deposit underscore events brackets equals default. Now again, even if you do know Rust, this isn't going to make any sense because this is part of this macro. So this macro reads this in a special way and does some stuff behind the scenes. But basically it says that we're going to call an event within this declare module macro somewhere in these functions. So even if you have, say, like 5 or 6 functions, you only need to state this once at the top. So it needs to be before the functions are called. Now we're going to jump right down to the function. And as we can see here, as with all functions, the first thing we're going to do is check the origin. So this is who's calling this function. And we want to check to make sure that someone has it's a signed function here, so it's someone who actually has permissions to do this, right? And it's going to say question mark to say, okay, throw an error if they're not someone who we want. And we have a little underscore here as the returning person who it is. So here's the caller, just to say we're not going to use this. So we could just have it as caller, or we should be able to do a little underscore caller here just to say that we are not using this function, or sorry, this variable necessarily. So it's going to tell the compiler that, we can go ahead and ignore this. Okay, so we've taken an input value of U32. And as it says here, in practice, we could do some processing with the input here. So we could take this input value, do some kind of, math with it, or save it, or do whatever we need to do. And now we have this new number. Now here comes down to the event part where we're going to emit the event. And now it's always going to follow this format, which is just going to be self, like this. It's going to be a deposit event, and we can see this up here. It's going to be the name of this function. And now we need to give it the event value. So first we need to say that it's an event. Then we're going to give the name of the event, whatever it may be. So this one is called emit input. And then we want to pass it the number. Okay, so in this case, it's going to be the new number. And don't forget to close it off, right? So it looks just the same here. And we're going to finish this up with an OK, because it's going to want to pass to the dispatch results here saying there wasn't an error, everything's OK. So this will be called, and then it'll be called OK. So a simple event is, knock on wood, fairly straightforward in the sense that there's not a lot of variations in how to call simple events. We could create a second function here and, just copy and paste this, and we could call this something function 2, and maybe it's calling a U16. So this is an unsigned integer. And we're going to add a second event here for this. And we need to match the type here, or we're going to get an error. Okay, so let's have a look here. Really, we can just use the same value because it's going to input to new number, and new number here, and it's all within the local scope, so these variables don't affect each other. Now we can go ahead and save this and run it, and I'm just going to run it from my terminal here. And I've already got my command typed in, but I'm using the kitchen node here. So I'm going to type cargo run -- bin to tell it which binary to run, which is the kitchen dash node. Then I'm going to go dash dash to pass it some parameters, and I'm going to run it in dev mode, which is dash dash dev space, and I'm going to do dash dash temp because we don't want to necessarily store the values. Great, now that my node is running, we're going to go over to the polkadot.js.org/app so we can have a front-end access to this running node, and we're going to go ahead and call some events. Now, if you're having any problems opening up this, the local node here, again, jump back to the first video and learn how to set up these settings with the developer mode. Okay, then we're going to go over to the Network Explorer. And let's see, actually, we're going to go to developer extrinsic. So this is extrinsic, so we're going to call something from outside the chain. And we're going to pick the module or the palette, that we want to call. So we had it called simple event. Now it's going to show the functions that are available, which is super neat here that we don't even need to know the name of the function. It's going to tell us. And as you can see here, it actually even displays what was the information above the function to give it a little more information. So here it says a simple call that does little more than emit an event. And let's look here and see a simple call that does a little more than emit an event. So that's awesome. Now let's see how well this works. So we can put in a U32 value, so say like 64 or 53 or whatever you want it to be. Submit that transaction. We're going to sign and submit that. Okay, we're going to open up the node here on polkadot.js.org/app. And if you're having trouble loading this, go back to an earlier tutorial here where we first use it. And we'll break down how to get this running in developer mode without any errors throwing up. But in the meantime, let's just keep looking here. We're going to go into developer. We're going to go to extrinsic. So extrinsics are something that we're going to call from off the chain onto the chain. We're going to call a function. And we want to choose the palette that we want to access. And the palette we're looking for is simple event. And then we're going to get the function. So we have do something and do something too. And as you can see here, it actually even has the description of the function that we wrote on it. So a simple call that does little more than emit an event. So if we look back at the code, we can see it right here above it. So we're going to use 3 backslashes, a simple call that does little more than emit an event. So that's great that it can pick it up, and it really helps us from a development perspective if we keep things nice and clean here. Now do something, and we can give it an input, and it knows automatically here the input is a U32. So an unsigned integer, and so we'll do 888, and we can submit this transaction. And it's going to basically just say, are you sure? And we're going to sign and submit that, and we can see that this was successful. Now why don't we do the do something too? We can give this a U16, so we'll say, I don't know, 765. We will submit this event as well. While we're not submitting the event, we're calling the function, and the function's being called properly, successfully, we're getting the event back, okay? So we're not really calling an event, we're calling the function that has the event in it. Now what we can do is go back to the Network Explorer, which is going to show us all the blocks and all the recent blocks. And if we go over here on the side, it's going to show us the recent events. So we can go ahead and open it and see the return values. So actually the event itself was just returning the number back. So that's what we're seeing here is the return value. And it's even giving us the name of the event. So it was simple event was the name of the palette, dot emit input was the name of the event, right? We can look over here, and it's going to say where it is. So this is block 1, block 2, right? And we can open up the block and explore it and see, what did we do? And we can see here that we called this function, through the extrinsics, and it gives us all the information about it. And here is the event that we called. Okay, so that's how you call an event using a Polkadot.js, or sorry, call a function and get the event information back. And in the next part, we're going to look at using generic events because we might need to pass information from the event that is a little more sophisticated, as well as, and we didn't cover in this one because I don't want to make it too long, we also need to look at setting up the events in the runtime because we do need to declare those in the runtime. So you're going to have an error if you just straight away do it like this. So let's look at the generics in the next video and get a little more details.